Yes, I do.
Okay, perfect. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. It's another one of our All Things Canada edition, and I am so happy to welcome back for the fourth time Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri, as everyone knows, was a former Green Party of Canada leader. He contested the Green Party Canada's leadership. He almost got there, second place consistently through the ranked choice voting, and we all know him as a former correspondent of the Real News. He's an environmentalist. He's a lawyer. He's an eco justice activist, social justice activist, anti-imperialist, and also part of Disruption Canada. So, Dimitri, welcome back on the show.
Always a pleasure talking to you, Youri. Thanks very much.
And it's a real honor to have you. And Dimitri, before we get to the questions at hand, I also have to say that one thing I really admire about you when I discovered you on the debates on the Real News, demanding that people stop tactical voting. I was always a huge fan of your journalism there, but I remember when the second time I interviewed you, and we talked about how you want mental health care to be merged with an existing with Canada's single payer system. And I remember I was saying to you, well, what do you say to those who say you're going to eliminate competition and so forth? And you made such a beautiful counter argument about how competition is good, and when it comes to mental health, it's a terrible thing because it leaves so many people who need help in a two-tiered system, which so many awful things happen, like spousal abuse or people getting involved in in substance abuse and so forth. A friend of mine who is an advocate of merging, of making mental health care free as part of a single payer system or a public option, said that she had never ever heard somebody, whether they were a politician or not, make such a compassionate arguments for people who have mental health but are not getting the treatment they deserve because the costs are so astronomical. And so for that, I still rewatch that interview sometimes, and when you were making that argument, like, it gave like a thrill up my spine, like, wow, this is a real compassionate gentleman right here. So
well, thank you for highlighting the issue. No, we don't talk about it enough. It's very important that it be talked about.
Exactly.
Thank you, Youri.
All right, so let's get to these questions because I think we don't have that much time to discuss. So Dimitri, what I wanted to talk to you about today, and it's funny because anyone who knows your journalism and your activism, and anyone who has watched my program, knows that we're very outspoken on about the left. We really don't like the pseudo-left. We really don't like the enemies within the left who support imperialism or who are selectively anti-war or who are outspoken when it comes to Black Lives Matter, but are silent on Indigenous issues and throw trans people and the queer community under the bus. But we're actually not going to be to talk about that. I actually wanted to talk to you about Canada's right wing, because for better or worse, we do live in a center right to far right world, and after the destruction of the Corbyn project, where I started to dig deeper into those on the left, like Blue Labour and so forth, who advocated leaving the European Union. And when I started to dig deeper and deeper into, their politics and some of their arguments, I started to realize that actually a lot of them were buying into a lot of right-wing stuff. And after the destruction of the Corbyn project, I realized that I completely underestimate the power of right-wing media and the Rupert Murdochs of the world. And with the election of Donald Trump, and the fact that, okay, Trump may be gone, but there still is a huge right-wing movement, and he did not lose by by a long shot. And I see, Macron and the Socialist Party all going further and further to the right. So I thought to myself that it's time to do a show where we actually talk about the right wing and how we push back against the right wing. And Canada is no stranger also to right wing oligarchs, and has a very robust right wing movement. And I'm scared to death that the Conservative Party is going to have a comeback. So we're going to talk about the right wing movements in Canada. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, briefly, if you can, what distinguishes the right wing in general in Canada from, say, the US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand?
I can't think of a single thing that distinguishes them, frankly. What are the hallmarks of the far right? The hallmarks of the far right are a antipathy towards groups that have historically been racialized and disadvantaged. Hostility, racism, hatred for Indigenous persons, persons of color, persons from the LGBTQ community, people. A tremendous disdain even for poor people who are white. So
Classism, yeah.
Absolutely. That's a hallmark of the right. A hallmark of the right is militarism, a belief that might makes right, a credible willingness to use force in order to impose one's will on those who are not able to defend themselves, a belief in small government. The less government we have, the better. A fundamental mistrust of the role that government plays in our lives, and a tolerance, even a desire to see a grotesquely unequal distribution of wealth in our society. These are the things that tend to characterize the right, and these are qualities that you'll find amongst the right throughout Western countries, all the countries that you mentioned. I think the only real distinction is not a distinction really in the nature of the right between the United States and Canada. Is just sort of the level of progress that they've made in terms of marshaling their forces. The far right is more significant in the United States than it is in Canada. But we in Canada have a very troubling tendency of playing catch up to the US, and events which transpire in the United States is oftentimes very troubling and even dangerous political developments. Eventually they manifest themselves here. It just takes a few years for us to play catch up. And so I think the far right is growing in Canada. It will continue to grow, and eventually it may become as powerful as the far right is currently in the United States. We can stop that
or Australia or Britain.
Yeah, we can stop that from happening, but to do that, we have to address the underlying conditions which make the rise of the right possible. Ultimately, what makes the rise of the right possible? Social injustice makes the rise of the right possible. Grotesque inequality. People in positions of influence using racism in order, not because they themselves are necessarily racist, but because using it advances some narrow self-interested political agenda that they happen to have. These are the things that we have to counter the narrative about the government being a nefarious force in our lives. The problem is not government. The problem is the people who are running the government. Mm-hmm. And that's a distinction we constantly have to make. I can understand why people are deeply mistrustful of the government. But this is not inherent in government per se. It's a function of the fact that the people who are running the government are basically in the service of the oligarchy. So if we in Canada address the underlying causes of the rise of right-wing movements, we can prevent ourselves from going to where the United States has gone. But if we don't do that, we are going to go there. And we're going to see our own Trumps coming to positions of significant power in this country.
And we're definitely going to talk about some of those provincial leaders who currently have a lot, who currently are in power in Canada. But before we get into Doug Ford, Jason Kenney, and the very, very far right media that that you do have in Canada, because when I asked you about what distinguishes the right wing in Canada from, say, the Tory party of Britain, or the Republican Party of the US, or the Liberal Party of Australia, the National Party, or the National Party of New Zealand, is is can you briefly talk about, what was the progressive conservative policy, the progressive conservative party? What was their legacy, particularly under, John Diefenbaker and people like, leaders of the opposition, Joe Clark, and then talk to us, sorry to throw so many questions, but like talk to us about, what the PC, what the PC was, what distinguished them from, say, the Reagans or the Kennedys, and then of course the rise of Brian Mulroney and his legacy in Canada.
The first of all, it's important to know that the Progressive Conservative Party federally is no more, because they excised from their name the term progressive. When they merged, I believe it was when they merged with the Reform Party, which was significantly.
No, actually, the Canadian Alliance.
Correct. Yes. So federally, we don't have a Progressive Conservative Party anymore. We still have the Progressive Conservative Party in name in Ontario, the most populous province in Canada, but that's a farce. I mean, there's nothing progressive about Doug Ford, the current Premier of Ontario, and I think that that's simply a historical artifact. The progressiveness have gone out of conservative politics in this country today, whatever the name of the party may or may not be. So, people like Joe Clark and Diefenbaker, I mean, in the time of John Diefenbaker, and this was also true of Joe Clark, although he came, some years later, the tax system was significantly more progressive. So for example, back in the 1950s, as today, people don't even know this in Canada. They'd be shocked to learn this, but it's easily ascertainable from the historical record. Back in the 1950s, the top marginal tax rate, that was when Diefenbaker was in power, was in excess of 90% in Canada and the United States. And now,
wow. So that's kind of like how Dwight Eisenhower, who's not a guy I would have voted for, but the rich paid taxes in the 90s back then.
The richest, yes, the highest income earners were paying in excess of 90% on the top marginal income. So today, of course, the leaders of these conservative parties, the heirs to the party that Diefenbaker and Joe Clark were the leaders of, would be horrified by a top marginal tax rate of 60 or 65%, let alone one in excess of 90. And in terms of privatization, so under Joe Clark, we had a national oil company, Petro-Canada, that was subsequently privatized. I believe it was by the Mulroney Conservatives. So the current iteration of the Conservative Party is much more committed to privatization and private sector, much less inclined to believe that certain sectors of the economy should be under democratic control. The kind of rhetoric that you see coming out of the Conservative Party today, the kind of insidiously, implicitly racist rhetoric and bigoted rhetoric, you rarely heard that from people like Joe Clark and John Diefenbaker, particularly Joe Clark. So there's been in terms of the rhetoric they employ, in terms of their view of economic policy, in terms of their view of wealth distribution, you have seen a very substantial shift to the right in Canada in the conservative movement. And now I would say that the conservative, the progressive conservatives as they existed in the time of Diefenbaker and Joe Clark are kind of where the Trudeau Liberals are now. They were right. Yeah, they were right wing, but they were not to the far end of the right side of the political spectrum. Today, the Conservatives in Canada, to my mind, they're far right. They are far right, especially in Alberta. Doug Ford, Stephen Harper, perhaps not quite so much the current federal Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole. Certainly, this was true of Stephen Harper. I think he was far right. And the Liberals have supplanted them as the sort of progressive Conservative Party. Where does that leave the supposedly Social Democratic Party, the NDP? They're firmly ensconced in the center. They're not left-wing anymore. We don't really have, and this is something I said over and over again in the leadership contest in the Green Party last year, we don't really have a left-wing party in Parliament today. So the whole of the left is unrepresented in Parliament for all intents and purposes.
But that said, Canada is a settler colonial society. It is an apartheid thing, but it is an apartheid regime. But it sounds to me as if the liberals, but we're not going to talk about the Liberal Party. But it sounds to me as if what used to be the progressive conservative, somebody like a John Diefenbaker or a Joe Clark, is it safe to say that they were compassionate conservatives or like one nation conservatives, where they did believe that go ahead.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by compassionate, right? They tolerated significant levels of poverty. They were fine with that. They may have had occasionally trotted out some rhetoric about having an anti-poverty agenda, but ultimately they were not willing to adopt the economic and social policies necessary to eliminate poverty. They weren't determined to eliminate homelessness, which is an absolute scourge and cannot be reconciled. Its existence cannot be reconciled with progressive policies or values. They were committed to Canada's participation in NATO, and pursued a foreign policy that was largely a pale imitation of U.S. imperialistic foreign policy. So, these guys were right wing, but at the same time, they weren't extremists relative to what we have today. Today, we have out and out extremists in political office in this country. And the problem is that the corporate media, it's so hard to convey this to people because the corporate media are continuing to attach to these same parties the same labels and rhetoric that they employed in the past. So they'll still say things like the Liberal is a centrist party. Liberals are a centrist party. I sometimes even see the corporate media refer to the Liberals as a center-left party, which just causes me to break out laughing.
Exactly.
And so the whole of the corporate media, even our state-owned broadcaster, the CBC, employs this language, which is concealing the fact that in politics in this country, federally and provincially, there's been a massive shift to the right. Not amongst the people of the country. It's just the divide between the political establishment and the will of the people has grown larger. But that's not reflected in the rhetoric and the terminology being employed by the corporate media. It's something that we in the independent media, like the Real News, we understand that, and we try to bring that point home as much as we can. But the corporate media are trying to bury that fact.
So then, so that being said, that's a perfect segue. That's a perfect segue to this, which is talk to us then about the dawn of what is called the neoliberalism era and that shift to more of a fiscal conservatism and market guruism, and talk to us about the start of endless shock doctrines and austerity, what I prefer to call neo-Dickensian or neoclassist ism, so talk to us about basically the legacy of former progressive conservative leader and former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney.
You hit the nail on the head. So that's really where, I mean, there was always some neoliberalism, and well before Mulroney came along, there was some neoliberalism in Canadian politics, but where it really took off was when Reagan and Thatcher and Mulroney came to power. And they had those of us who lived through that era, and I did, it was like a constant love fest. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and it was like the holy trinity of neoliberalism in the West. And, he did things like, he cut taxes. He privatized very important state-owned enterprises. One of the things he privatized, which is having a dramatic effect on us right now, the Mulroney government sold off a wonderful state-owned pharmaceutical company called Conrad Labs. And it really was doing for decades cutting-edge medical research and pharmaceutical research. And as a result of the sale of Conrad Labs, today we do not have in this country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world with the national healthcare system, really the capacity to develop and manufacture on a mass scale the kind of vaccine that we need to deal with the pandemic. That's the legacy of Brian Mulroney more than anybody else. So he's the one who really began to champion the notion of privatization. He began to champion these free trade agreements. It was under Mulroney that free trade is a misnomer. It's really trade that is managed, not free, but managed for the benefit of multinationals and the economic elite globally. So he began that process, and now it's like, think when I was growing up, when we were debating at the time that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was adopted, there was a very broad section of the Canadian, not just Canadian public, but the Canadian establishment that was deeply concerned. And you saw this being debated in the corporate media, deeply concerned about entering into a free trade agreement with the United States. And many of the things that they warned about at the time, like the loss of good paying manufacturing jobs in Canada, came to pass. But today you can't even have a robust debate in the corporate media about free trade agreements. It's just a given that the more so-called free trade we have, the better off our people will be, even though the economic evidence leaves no doubt that that's a complete crock. So the terms of debate have shifted. In Mulroney's time, like, he broke through that barrier, and using the rhetoric of neoliberalism, of free markets, of privatization, he managed to, I think, set Canada on a path to where we are now today, which is a shocking divide by Canadian standards in terms of the haves and the have-nots, more racism than we've seen in a long time, more distrust of government than we've seen in a long time. So that's very much the legacy of Brian Mulroney.
Well, interesting that you say that, but is it safe to say that Brian Mulroney, and I've seen many prime minister debates when he was running to be prime minister, when he even was prime minister and trying to win re-election, he was a very good communicator. I think kind of like sort of like Joe Clark, and to an extent Chrétien and Paul Martin. He was a very good communicator. There was a certain charm for about him, because Pierre Trudeau and for better or worse, but he was a bit of a sleazy, very cheeky prime minister who sometimes he would do something which was left wing, but then he would go around and do something which was very right wing, and he was also very anti. People don't know about his awful imperialism, but he was very anti-Indigenous. And do you think that was and do you think, like, at some point people just kind of got fed up with the Liberal Party, so that's why Brian Mulroney got into power?
Sure, the same is true of the Harper Conservatives. Really, the reason why they ultimately rose to power was because people were sick of the hypocrisy and the corruption of the Martin Liberals. There was a huge scandal here, a political financing scandal in Canada, which I think did more to bring Stephen Harper to power.
Sponsorship scandal, right?
Absolutely. And people were fed up. And this is the nefarious roles the Liberals play. They not only deceive the public about they campaign to the left, govern from the right, and this is something that they've perfected to an art form. But what they also do is, over time, people eventually realize that the rhetoric is empty, and so they lay the groundwork for some ever more right-wing conservative party to supplant them. And this is the cycle that we're trapped in here politically in Canada. You get a Liberal Party which campaigns on the left, governs from the right. People get fed up. They look at the first past the post system and they say, well, realistically, I only have another alternative, and that's the Conservative Party. None of these other parties are ever going to hold power. So I'm going to vote Conservative to get rid of those bastards in the Liberal Party. And then, the Conservatives will, ever shifting to the right, will implement their neoliberal agenda even more ferociously than the Liberals will. People get fed up with that. We go back to the Liberals. And then they again.
So it becomes a vicious cycle.
Absolutely. We've been trapped in this cycle for the entire post-World War II period.
But when it comes about, you've talked a lot about homelessness and the epidemic of homelessness in Canada, and is it safe to say that a lot of that, as well as mass incarceration of Black people and the working class, a lot of that you can actually so Trudeau does play a role, the Liberal Party does play a role in that, but Brian Mulroney, when he championed NAFTA and so many jobs were sent to either an impoverished part of the U.S. or mainly Mexico, and of course we now see this with China, which is now giving rise to the xenophobia. Is it safe to say Brian Mulroney, a lot of that deindustrialization, so forth, a lot of that you can actually blame on Brian Mulroney's, kind of Reaganomics? I
think the Mulroney era was really a turning point for this country. That's where we really accelerated the shift away from the relatively egalitarian socioeconomic conditions that prevailed in Canada for the 50s and the 60s. In the when I grew up in the 60s, I was born in 1963 in Southern Ontario. And when I grew up back then, a factory worker could have a middle-class life. Most factory workers, especially ones who had been, employed for 10, 15 years, they were unionized, they were earning good wages, good benefits, and they led a middle-class life. That process really began to deteriorate. We began to see a shrinking of the middle class, an increase in inequality, increase in poverty and homelessness when the Mulroney government came into power. And of course, since then, every single government, whether liberal or conservative, has exacerbated the situation. And probably no government more so than the Harper government. But the Liberal government is continuing to exacerbate it as well. It's just by comparison to the Harper government, they seem progressive.
So that being said, that's actually a perfect segue then to, now after the Canadian electorate, which overwhelmingly, as you said, disapproved of Mulroney's free trade deals and saw that and saw the fabric of society being dismantled. So after Brian Mulroney, he was replaced by Kim Campbell, who I think the electorate was a bit too harsh on her, but she was massacred in the general elections by the Liberal Party under Jean Chrétien, and his finance minister, as you mentioned, was Paul Martin. Now, if Mulroney was a soft Reagan, and Chrétien and Martin are sort of like, Bob Hawke and Clinton, a movement came about in Canada called the Reform Movement. Can you talk to us about the Reform Party, Preston Manning, and their contribution to the right-wing movements that we see in Canada? Talk to us about the Reform Party and Preston Manning.
Well, it's been a while now since the Reform Party has been around, so I'm kind of having to go back and consult my memory banks. They've been gone now for some 15 years or more. But the Reform Party, as I recall them, were very, very focused on deficit spending. Okay, they had a fixation with balanced budgets and what they called, conservative fiscal management, which isn't actually conservative at all.
Which is funny. Sorry to interrupt. Which is funny because every single prime minister debate I've ever seen on Canada, from when Tommy Douglas was leader of the NDP, there's an obsession in Canada about deficits, and so it's funny that you mentioned that the Reform Party was particularly obsessed about that cynical distraction. Continue.
And by the way, virtually all of them engage in very significant deficit spending. So again, there's always a disconnect between the rhetoric of these people and their actual policies and practices. But yes, they were very, very focused on balanced budgets. They hated deficits. They hated debt. I think they preyed quite a bit on the notion or the sentiment of Western alienation, a feeling that the resource-rich, the oil-rich provinces, particularly Alberta, were not being given a fair shake by the federal government in Ottawa. That was a big theme of theirs. I think that there was
any truth to that, though.
No, I think absolutely not. I mean, look, even to this very day.
Okay.
Federally, the government is continues to this very day to be subsidizing the fossil fuels industry, which is concentrated in Alberta, overwhelmingly in the province of Alberta. We are basically throwing gasoline on the climate fire with federal tax dollars, and so in what sense do Albertans actually have a justification for feeling as though they have been exploited by the federal government? I really don't think that's true. I think this is a sentiment that has been whipped up, a kind of fervor that politically ambitious people on the right have tried to exploit. Including the Reform Party. I just don't think that there's any real reality to it whatsoever. And the people in Alberta too tend to be more conservative leaning. So
the people of Alberta, do they tend to be not only fiscally conservative but also socially conservative?
Absolutely. They're very socially conservative.
And the Reform Party champions that. Them and Preston Manning champions that.
Yes, they were much more socially conservative. So they would be, as I recall, they would be much more willing, for example, to challenge the notion of a woman's right to choose. They would have given much more space to people who wanted to take away, a woman's ability to have an abortion. So they were definitely more socially conservative, definitely more fixated on balanced budgets, more hostile to deficit spending, very much committed ideologically to the notion of the smallest possible government. And then, of course,
so libertarian.
Yes, yes, and very much this notion of Western alienation, which we just talked about. That was really what the Reform Party was. The Reform Party was just a more right-wing version of the Conservative Party. And
of the PC, yeah.
That's all. They were essentially the conservatives without the progressive. And so when they merged, they got rid of the word progressive, and they basically became the Reform Party, and have continued to move right from the Reform Party ever since. They've become increasingly right-wing.
But the Reform Party, perfect segue to the next to the next question. But the Reform Party transformed themselves because there were members who thought that the Reform Party wasn't fiscally conservative or socially conservative enough, and so they became the Canadian Alliance. Right. So talk to us about the Canadian Alliance, because that is where our friend Stephen Harper comes from. So talk to us about the Canadian Alliance.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know that much about the Canadian Alliance, Youri. I have to tell you, I should preface this by pointing out that for much of this period, I was living outside of Canada. So I was living,
in France.
In the 90s and the early 2000s. I was living not just in France. I lived in New York City for a while, where I was practicing law. I also spent some time in Australia. So I didn't live through part of this development. The Canadian Alliance is a bit foreign to me, thankfully. But this was really, I think, as I recall, the Canadian Alliance was just fanatical about in its opposition to taxation. Absolutely fanatical in terms of its opposition to deficit spending. Absolutely just hostile, profoundly hostile to the notion of government at all, and the belief in the government must be made as small and as ineffectual as possible, and give people the greatest possible, in theory, the greatest possible degree of freedom. Of course, if you're poor, you don't really have freedom, something which the conservatives, ignore. And in order to avoid poverty or lift people out of poverty, you will need massive government intervention. But this rhetoric continues to hold sway in the mainstream media that smaller government means more individual liberty. That's just a fallacy. So the Canadian Alliance, as I recall, was very, very much very dogmatic on these issues, and kind of laid the groundwork for the Conservative Party to become what it is today ideologically, which is, in my opinion, a far right party.
And perfect answer. So talk to us about how the Progressive Conservative Party, which was devastated after the the sort of left nationalism hatred that people had for Brian Mulroney, and the business community felt that Brian Mulroney sort of sold them out by allowing America to dominate the economy. How much that's true, I honestly can't comment too much about. But talk about how the Progressive Conservative Party, which was diminishing, merged with the Canadian Alliance. And from there, talk to us about the rise of Stephen Harper, why the electorate voted for Stephen Harper, and talk to us about Stephen Harper. Anything and everything that you think people should know about him.
I think Stephen Harper, is largely the Harper era is largely a function of the Martin government's failings. So I think that really fundamentally, even I myself was so fed up with the Liberals. I was at the point of just anybody but the Liberals. The arrogance of these people.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. Like, I just wanted the Liberals out of office. I didn't really understand. A lot of people didn't. I'm not saying that I was a Harper supporter. I never had any sympathy for Harper. But there was so much exasperation with the Liberals, their entitlement, their dishonesty, their betrayal of the electorate, and so forth.
Them continuing Brian Mulroney's policies. Was that another reason why so many people just hated Chrétien and later his replacement Paul Martin after a while?
Yeah, Martin, was a senior executive of a large company. He was a very wealthy man, and he implemented an austerity agenda, despite the progressive rhetoric of the Liberal Party. That was probably the harshest austerity that Canada has experienced at the federal level Even going back to the Mulroney era.
Oh, wow.
It's very, very significant budget cutting by the Martin government. So all of this conspired to lay the groundwork for Stephen Harper to come to power. And another factor which I think played into his hands was, on the issues of security and foreign policy. Remember, back when Stephen Harper came to power, we were very much at that point embroiled, still are today, but we were embroiled in this newly launched war on terrorism. And there was this rhetoric of insecurity, and we're under attack, and we need a strong, powerful government that's willing to, where necessary or appropriate, curtail our civil liberties for our own protection, expansion of certain powers. So, I mean, that people weren't explicitly couching it in that way, but there was a more tolerance for the notion of, surveillance, more tolerance for the notion of curtailment of civil liberties, because of this obsession with terrorism in the aftermath of 9/11. And Stephen Harper and his party very much spoke that language and appealed to people who had been swept up by the fervor of, the sort of pro-security fervor that followed the 9/11 attacks. So those two phenomenon came together really to lay the groundwork for Stephen Harper's ascension to power. And if it wasn't for those two things, I very much doubt that Stephen Harper ultimately would have won an election. I think he wouldn't have succeeded. The Liberals
and before you talk to us about the various legacies of Stephen Harper, who, by the way, loved Preston Manning of the Reform Party. He actually was a member of the Reform Party and later was even leader of the Canadian Alliance before they merged with the Progressive Conservative. But talk to us about the sponsorship scandal, which was the final straw where the Canadian electorate said, we're not giving Paul Martin and the Liberal Party another chance.
Well, again, these are the details of this, we're going back in time, but the sponsorship scandal involved basically, there are limits under Canada's campaign finance laws as to how much money people can contribute and how the money can be contributed. And basically what was happening was the Liberals were circumventing the campaign finance laws, principally here in Quebec, where I reside, by taking, cash donations and just flagrantly violating the law in that regard. And so this came to light, and when it did come to light, people realized that the Liberals, were willing to do just about anything in order to advantage themselves from an electoral perspective, including flout the country's campaign finance laws. So that was, I think, the death blow for the Martin government. The fact that it implemented an austerity regime definitely was a factor as well. But that, as I say, laid the groundwork for the rise of Stephen Harper.
Talk to us about Stephen Harper then. Talk to us about his period in government and his various awful legacies that he left the country.
Stephen Harper eviscerated our environmental laws. To give you an example, he actually imposed a gag order. His government imposed a gag order, a gag law on scientists in the employ of the Canadian government. So they couldn't, without the permission of the government, talk publicly about their scientific work. So there were a lot of wonderful scientists doing work around climate change in this country. They were doing work around the ecological impacts of fossil fuels extraction and the burning of fossil fuels, the health impacts. He basically silenced the scientific community. He was absolutely, again, fanatically opposed to the notion of a carbon tax. He was absolutely hell-bent on doing anything necessary from a legislative or a policy perspective to enable the tar sands industry to extract every last, ounce of bitumen out of the ground in northern Alberta. So he was opposed in any way, shape, or form to any kind of constraint on the development of that industry, which has done immense, incalculable damage to the environment and has been a huge contributor to the climate crisis. So he was adamantly opposed to a climate treaty along the lines of the one that we got out of Paris in 2015, even though it's pathetically weak.
Exactly.
Inadequate. Stephen Harper, I think, would never have signed Canada onto that agreement. And I think he would have done everything within his power to sabotage that agreement. He set a climate target. Of course, his climate targets were meaningless because he never actually implemented the policies necessary to meet his targets, but his targets were very weak. And the target that he set he was smart enough to know that the political winds on climate change were shifting in an unfavorable direction for Canada's tar sands industry. So he purported to adopt a climate target without any plan to implement it. That climate target was, as I recall, a reduction by 2000. Canada would reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to 2005 levels, something along those lines. And when the Liberals were it's just an indication of how we're constantly shifting rightward in politics in this country. When the Liberals were in opposition, they vociferously criticized Stephen Harper's climate target, which was meaningless anyways because he wasn't going to do what was necessary to meet it. But as soon as they came into power in 2015, just before the Paris Climate Accord was entered into, they adopted his climate target. And of course, are we actually on path to meet that climate target? No. We're not. We're on a trajectory right now to exceed it by a very significant margin. But yeah, so his primary legacy was destruction of environmental laws, environmental protections, silencing the scientific community, doing everything conceivable to enhance the interests of the extractive sector, not just the tar sands industry, but the mining industry, the extractive sector, ensuring that we didn't have in place a legal regime that held Canadian extractive companies accountable for their human rights violations domestically and abroad. He put in place this meaningless, toothless sort of regime of voluntary self-regulation, which was completely ineffectual. He was absolutely obsessed with security. So he adopted laws, that imposed very serious constraints on the civil liberties of Canadians, greatly expanded the power of CSIS, the National Spy Agency, to surveil on Canadians.
Canada's deep states.
Yeah. So he and his foreign policy was, just completely aligned with American foreign policy, in possibly, arguably, even more right-wing than the foreign policy of the Obama administration, if you can believe that.
Yeah.
So for example, Obama actually did try to impose some constraint, did try to encourage the Israeli government to not be so aggressive in its theft of Palestinian land. Stephen Harper was, in every way, shape, or form, an advocate for the state of Israel. Israel could do no wrong. The Obama administration was willing to publicly scold the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, but not Harper. So it's just indicative of how right-wing he was in terms of foreign policy, even more right-wing, as I say, than the Obama administration.
But just to follow up to that before we talk about people like Conrad Black and Ezra Levant and Rebel Media, but now anyone who has seen my show knows that I'm certainly no fan of Donald Trump, but I don't engage in anti-Trump derangement syndrome. I certainly don't think that Trump was this, Russian puppet. I mean, that's, as John Pilger says, that's a bunch of bollocks. But Stephen Harper, though, in defense of Stephen Harper, wasn't there a bit too much of an anti-Harper derangement syndrome? Because in the end of the day, Stephen Harper, was he really that different from Chrétien, from Brian Mulroney, from Paul Martin? Because in the end of the day, he was just a rival oligarch, and it seemed as if everybody who was criticizing Stephen Harper, especially the media, which we have to be honest, the media was very hostile towards Stephen Harper, because so much of the media does support the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party has been in power for so long. So, anyways, long story short, don't you think that that Harper supporters are right when they say that there was too much of a bias against Stephen Harper when he more or less just continued the trajectory that was started by, all other, leaders before him?
Well, I just want to, before I answer your question, just correct one thing you said. I don't think that the corporate media was hostile to Stephen Harper. I mean, the largest newspaper publisher in Canada is Post Media, by far the largest newspaper publisher. It's now controlled, I believe, by a hedge fund in Connecticut. And
Post Media is where the National Post comes from, right?
That's its flagship newspaper, and that was, I believe, founded by Conrad Black, the now convicted felon, Conrad Black. So
actually, he's Lord Conrad Black, Dimitri.
Well, wasn't his lordship taken away from him?
Actually, yes, that's true. That's true because apparently he was stealing from the Daily Telegraph pensioners, just like Robert Maxwell in the Daily Mirror. Yeah.
He's Lord Black no more. But in any event, as I recall, back so Post Media owns a lot of newspapers, not just the National Post, from coast to coast. It has like major dailies in Ottawa, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, I believe Edmonton. So it basically the corporate management ordered all of the editors in the Post Media empire to endorse the Harper government in the 2015 election, as I recall, which is very unusual from a journalistic perspective. According to journalistic tradition in Canada, usually, editors of newspapers will be given the discretion to endorse candidates of their own liking. But this was something that was, quite a scandal at the time. Our national broadcaster, CBC, I think probably was, significantly hostile to Stephen Harper, but they were quite muted in their criticism of the Harper government because they had funding concerns. But yeah, is it true nonetheless that there was too much of a fixation on the person of Stephen Harper, and it became a distraction away from the underlying conditions that made the rise of a Stephen Harper possible? Absolutely. Absolutely, that's true. I couldn't agree more. It wasn't as extreme as it was in the United States. I mean, the United States, I sometimes force myself, Youri, to watch mainstream media outlets like CNN, just so that I know what they're telling people. It's important to be aware of the propaganda that they're disseminating.
I used to torture myself doing that with the BBC.
Yeah, you have to limit your exposure to it because otherwise you end up shooting yourself. But it got to the point where I literally, during the Trump administration, I couldn't even take CNN in limited quantities. As much as I loathed Trump, I was so happy to see him go. He was a disaster. It was nonstop vitriol against Donald Trump. There wasn't even a pretense of journalistic objectivity. Absolutely none. So if Trump, because Trump actually did do some things which weren't bad, like he didn't start any new wars, okay? And then, of course, there's this Russiagate business, which was an absolute hoax, a complete and utter propaganda campaign against Donald Trump. There were so many legitimate reasons to criticize him and to oppose him, and they had to invent something out of thin air to completely distract the Canadian.
So that being said, and is the reason why you're saying all of this to me because Stephen Harper, okay, even though he was very much a political outsider, to an extent that he was, a newly formed party and his legacy with the Reform Party and Canadian Alliance, but at the end of the day, no, he had a lot of media outlets that supported him, including the supposedly liberal party supporting Globe and Mail also supported his prime ministership and endorsed him, right?
Yeah. So, but to answer your question directly, we had our Harper derangement syndrome, but it wasn't nearly as severe a case as we saw in the United States.
Yeah.
It is true. And this is not just true of Stephen Harper. It's not just true of Donald Trump. It's true generally about our approach to politics. We focus too much on individuals and not on policy issues and how policy decisions impact ordinary people, and especially the most vulnerable members of our society. And that was certainly true of Stephen Harper.
So talk to us then about you mentioned Conrad Black. Can you talk to us about who this Canadian oligarch, who this one fashion of the Canadian oligarch is, and what has been his legacy in Canada, and then talk to us about rebel media led by Ezra Levant.
Mm-hmm. So Conrad Black founded the National Post, I think somewhere around 20 years ago, and ostensibly for the purpose of giving the right a full-throated voice in this country. He didn't think that there was
the fiscal conservatives and the socially conservatives.
Yes, absolutely. And so, the National Post became, in terms of journalism in this country, or what purports to be journalism, the vanguard of the right. And then gradually, the National Post his parent company, Post Media, began to snap up newspapers all over Canada, and it became the largest newspaper publisher. The National Post, so to give you just a taste of what the National Post and Post Media are like, they've got this character, a columnist by the name of Rex Murphy, who is an out climate change denialist, okay? He's still, to this very day, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence, we are cooking the planet and are confronted by an existential threat. To this very day, he's writing columns in the National Post where he's insidiously, raising doubt about climate science and expressing hostility, outright hostility towards any policies that are designed meaningful to address it. This is the kind of newspaper which employs a language, tries to characterize the Liberals as being left-wing. And they try to characterize the NDP as being far left. When it's really a centrist party. This is the type of newspaper that will demonize environmentalists, as tree huggers, as people who are utopians, people who are going to destroy the economy, cause Canadians to lose jobs en masse. I don't regard the National Post, this creation of Conrad Black, as being a newspaper. I don't think it is a news. It is really just an out-and-out propaganda organ. Once in a while, you'll see in the National Post, once in a blue moon, a real example or an arguable example of journalism. But mostly it's just unmitigated right-wing propaganda, and that's what Conrad Black founded it to be, whether he would admit it or not. Unfortunately for Conrad, he became embroiled in a securities fraud and was convicted not by a Canadian court, even though he was living in Canada, even though this is where his newspaper empire was based. We had to rely upon the United States Federal District Court to convict Conrad Black of various felonies. And so he went off to jail. To this very day, he protests his innocence.
Trump even pardons him. Trump gave him a full presidential pardon.
Yeah, they're ideologically two birds of a feather, Conrad Black. Conrad Black, I think actually, if you read Conrad, occasionally the National Post lets Conrad write for them nowadays. Conrad Black, I think, is actually comes very close to saying outright, explicitly, that he's hostile to democracy. I don't think Conrad Black believes in democracy, or that he himself would consider himself a pro-democracy person. I think he believes in aristocracy. He thinks there's a class that is the natural ruling class. He's a member of that class, and the rest of us should just shut up and take orders from the ruling class. That's who Conrad Black is. And to this very day, because of the breadth of the post-media empire, we are living with the legacy of Conrad Black in this country.
And was the National Post for the right wing in Canada, people who are tired of being hostile towards America and actually wants to openly embrace America and wants more, fiscal conservatism and wants the Christian rights of Canada, which is very small, but some have a voice. Was the National Post for them, kind of like what Fox News is in the U.S. or the Daily Mail and Murdoch's stuff is in Australia? Because because once upon a time you did have the progressive conservatives who may have been fiscally conservative, but they had a little bit of like a one nation Toryism about it, whereas the National Post is just like, we're tired of we're tired of like political correctness. We're tired of the Liberals who, as you say, they're too left, and that's why they were so popular. And I imagine they probably supported the idea of the Reform Party and Canadian Alliance, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't actually go so far as to say that the National Post is as bad as the right-wing press in Britain or as Fox News, but they're close. And the only reason they're not as bad is because of the sentiment of the Canadian electorate. I think we tend to be more progressive in our thinking here in Canada than in the United States. Arguably also in Britain. And so they can't, at the National Post, go quite as far in terms of their right-wing rhetoric and their machinations and their propaganda as Fox News can get away with. But it is our version of Fox News, just this kind of muted Fox News, a little less audacious Fox News. The sooner that company, it goes out of business, frankly, and we find other things for the people working at the National Post to do to contribute, positively to Canadian society and the economy, the better off we'll be. That newspaper empire is doing inestimable damage to the future of this country.
And they tend to support the the now new the Conservative Party when it was Harper, right, and now Aaron O'Toole and Andrew Scheer, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I mean the National Post is probably to the right of Biden. So the National Post, I didn't check, but I'm sure that they went hog wild when Biden announced that he was canceling the Keystone XL pipeline.
Yeah,
the National kind of newspaper which would have berated by the Biden administration for doing that, and would have given space to somebody like Jason Kenney, who was actually calling the Premier of Alberta, the oil-rich province, was calling on the federal government to impose sanctions on the United States because Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. This is the kind of lunacy, right-wing lunacy you find in the National Post. So it's even ideologically to the right of, the Obama administration or the Biden administration.
Let's talk about the far right. During Stephen Harper's leadership, many people were surprised that although he was certainly more fiscally conservative, when it came to social issues, he kind of backed off, from them. But he wasn't as socially conservative as the Reform Party or Canadian Alliance, the party that he was leader of, but he certainly was fiscally conservative and certainly was another one of those law and order types. Talk to us about Ezra Levant and Rebel Media, which came about during his reign.
Let me just say that I actually believe that Stephen Harper was fanatically socially conservative.
Yeah.
But he was also, the one thing about Stephen Harper, he was very cunning politically, and he knew, for example, that if his party adopted, I suspect he's very much anti-choice, and that if he was able to impose his will, he would have deprived women of a right to choose.
Yeah,
he's an evangelical Christian, but he knew that doing that in Canada would be a political death sentence for the Conservative Party. So he basically muzzled the people within his own party. He kept his own views to himself, and he muzzled the people within his own party. But in any event, so Ezra Levant, strangely enough, is a lawyer. He's based in Alberta. As you mentioned, he founded or co-founded an organization called Rebel Media. I mean, Rebel Media is
and sorry to interrupt. But before he headed Rebel Media, which is the right-wing climate denialist version of what the Young Turks are in the U.S. So the Young Turks are of a Clinton Sanders type, but Ezra Levant, I think it's safe to say, Rebel Media, far right. But before that, he had the Sun News Network. I just had to mention that.
Yes, which was a far right news network, which mercifully went out of business, I think. So Rebel Media. Look, I haven't watched it. Again, I force myself to watch it sometimes just to be aware of what it was saying. But I know that a lot of the work that it did really smacked of Islamophobia. Very, very sort of obsessive about the war on terror, supportive, of course, of the war on terror. Extreme in its foreign policy prescriptions. Implacably hostile to social programs. Completely supportive of the surveillance state, curtailment of civil liberties in order to protect Canadians from the ever-present and mortal scourge of terrorism. This is the kind of language playing on people's fears, playing on their ignorance, scapegoating marginalized groups in order to advance an oligarchic political agenda. That's what Rebel Media is, and it's become so toxic that not even the Conservative Party will openly associate with Rebel Media any longer. And interestingly, Rebel is, it's quite litigious, Rebel Media, and so a couple of people, more than a couple of people, have said the things that I just said about Rebel Media. Rebel Media sued two of them for defamation, and 2 months ago, both of the defamation lawsuits brought by Rebel Media were dismissed under what we call anti-SLAPP legislation. A SLAPP is a strategic lawsuit against public participation. This is a relatively new law in Canada. It's designed to get rid of lawsuits that have no merit and that are brought just to silence somebody who's criticizing the plaintiff legitimately. And so, when he brought these claims against people who had said the kinds of things about Rebel Media that I had said, they brought anti-SLAPP motions and they prevailed, all within the space of a few days. And so his lawsuits were dismissed. The interesting question, one that I would love to, sorry, that's me.
Yeah.
An interesting question I'd love to be able to figure it out is where's the funding coming from for Rebel Media? Because so for example, the lawsuits that it brought, the defamation lawsuits that it brought, this is not something you can do unless you bring multiple defamation lawsuits. And his organization was involved in other litigation surrounding, some scandalous things that he said. I know that it was sued for defamation as well. Where do you find the money to, conduct your operations and engage in litigation of that nature? Pay Ezra Levant a salary.
I actually might have a theory for you. Because I think, to use Donald Trump as an example, David K. Johnston, who's probably the best journalist when it comes to all things Donald Trump, although he engaged in anti-Russia conspiracy theories, but I'm not going to get into that. But he once said on Democracy Now! That Donald Trump appeals to people's worst instincts, and that he appeals to groups of people who, because you can't say outright, I hate indigenous people, I don't want to sit next to.
I'm sorry. I'm late for a call. 1 second.
Oh, okay. Oh,